My family and I moved to Hollows Grove around 9 months before this year's Sommerstide celebration began, missing the previous year's event by only 90 days or so. Having always loved Halloween, I grew excited about experiencing this the second I heard about it. As relocating to a new school right as my 11th grade was beginning was far more uncomfortable than getting used to a new town, I just tried to keep to myself for the most part. For those first few months, other than some minor altercations, things went quite smoothly. But John Briggs, the quarterback of the football team, had other plans. He had openly mocked me for the better part of half a year, but I never let loudmouth assholes bother me much. After attempting to push me around a bit though, my slimmer stature and introverted nature making me what he assumed to be an easy target, he gave up on his attempts to bully me, after I showed him that appearances can be quite deceiving. Sure, he had no way of knowing that I had practiced jujitsu since I was 7, nor that I could have hurt him far more than I did, but he wasn't the first to attempt to clean my clock just based on my smaller frame, and I was certain he wouldn't be the last. Unfortunately, given that he had tried to humiliate me in front of half of the school population before I flipped the script on him, I ended up with far more eyes on me than I had hoped for. I wasn't antisocial or anything, somewhat introverted, but not entirely that loner type. But that doesn't mean I ever wanted to be the talk of the whole damn school either. Some days after I broke the nose of my attempted bully, John approached me in a far more friendly manner. I wasn't looking to join any sort of group, nor was I particularly interested in making friends for that matter. But I can't deny that the idea of being a member of the popular crowd could be quite nice for a change. Though I didn't feel like I had much in common with John, his twin brother Jace, nor Dylan and Kyle, 2 more members of the football team who had known the Briggs boys since 3rd grade, I did enjoy their company, for the most part, even if they could be quite exhausting to be around at times. Regardless of the busy schedule of having such attention-seeking friends, I would still find time to focus on the things I wanted to. One of which was my regular visits with the man known as the town's resident crackpot, someone I grew quite fond of quickly. It was he who initiated our first conversation, taking a seat beside me at the local park, only a few months after our arrival in this small slice of the country. I found this spot to be a peaceful place to get away from everyone, to just read, sketch for a time, or simply be alone with my thoughts. The bench was a little far off the beaten path, far enough from the kids playing or the family sharing picnics and the like. Though I could still hear the ambient sounds of children laughing and adults talking, my surroundings were otherwise quite tranquil. When Mr. Stanley Crockett walked up that day, asking politely to share the bench for a time, I was honestly tempted to just get up and allow him the solitude I had been enjoying. But there was just something so innocent and childlike in his expression, something kind that reminded me of my grandfather before he passed, that I decided to share his company after all. It was mildly awkward at first, the two of us just sitting in silence, gazing out into the beautiful scenery. But when he began to talk, just casually speaking of some of the town's history, this park in particular, I found myself quickly immersed in what he had to say. For the next few weeks, every Wednesday afternoon, I would meet him there after school. He would regale me with a new tale with each visit, from stories of the initial settlers to some of his own experiences as a younger man. He had such an enthralling way of spinning these yarns, he could probably talk a member of the undead down from chewing on his scalp were he put in that position. We would share laughter as well as the occasional tears over days gone by. As the months drew closer to Sommerstide, however, his tales grew somewhat darker and much harder to actually believe in all honesty. He seemed both in awe of and intimidated by this town's annual rituals, claiming that he had witnessed firsthand the darker side of the celebration. He never got into specifics of his experiences, only what seemed like urban legends of people who weren't around anymore. No matter how much I pressed him to tell me his story, he wouldn't budge. Sure, I didn't exactly entertain his passionate beliefs in the supernatural, but I still wanted to know more, even if only to understand why he grew so pale when he would drift to this subject matter. As it turned out, I would get those answers before the season came to a close. Not only that, but I would share his intimidation and fear over the true darkness of what lies beneath the surface of Hollows Grove. After this Sommerstide, the first and only one I would ever celebrate, I would never see reality the same way again. Crockett respectfully asked me to leave him be on the night of the festival itself. Though he wouldn't speak about it, regardless of the many other tales he told me over the months, he often reflected on his greatest regret in life, the incident that occurred when he was around my age, on this very night. While I hoped I could convince him to get out of the house and even accompany me to the town square to check out the festivities, I didn't push it. I had grown a good deal of respect for the old guy, and even if I couldn't know what ghosts actually haunted him, I understood his need for isolation, whether he would share his reasons with me or not. I honestly wasn't in the mood for John and the guys, rolling my eyes when I received his message about gathering at his place. I just wanted to indulge myself in this fascinating town ritual by myself, but he could be a singularly stubborn asshole about things at times. With a heavy sigh and a good deal of reluctance, I replied to his text with an unenthusiastic, "Okay." My mother was hanging out on the front deck with a basket load of hazelnuts and an exhilarated expression on her face when I walked out. She was just watching the kids walking the streets, giggling at some of the more creative and outlandish costumes. She loves Halloween just as much as I do, and absolutely adored handing out candy with her soundtrack of spooky music. While neither of us were certain if the macabre decorations or eerie tunes were commonplace for this holiday, that didn't stop her from loading up her playlist. We did hang a few of our well-traveled skeletons from the tree in the front yard as well, just to embrace the season, though it looked like we were the only ones who added that particular flair to their front yard, judging by the neighboring homes. She was chuckling at an adorable duet of maybe 5-year-old ghouls walking hand in hand with their parents after retrieving their offerings from her when I walked by. I just gave her a kiss on the cheek while she asked me to be careful out there. "I will. I'll see you later, Mom," I said with a wave and a smile. I was almost exhausted by the thought of having to entertain my friends for the night, uncertain of what shenanigans John may have in store, but that didn't stop me from grinning like an excited toddler at the sights surrounding me as I climbed into my beat-up old Chevy. I passed by Crockett's place on the way to the Briggs house, snickering a little at the creepy skull lantern hanging on his front door. And whether he cared for this time of year or not, it seemed that even he couldn't resist embracing a little of the lore after all. Maybe 10 minutes later, after having to drive much more carefully with so many kids lining the streets, I pulled into John's driveway. Letting out another sigh when I saw him and Jace passing a flask back and forth while flipping me off from the patio, I had no doubt that they were already plastered, which only fueled my building tension. Jace was a lot more mellow than his twin, when he was sober anyway. A few beers down the hatch and he could be the loudest and most obnoxious son of a bitch, but I still tried to not let that dampen my spirits. Of course, my initial plan was to bail if they ended up being a handful. Given that Dylan and Kyle both appeared to be pretty wasted themselves, red, puffy eyes and a steady sway from side to side, it would seem that I was to be their designated driver for the night. Sure, I could still ditch their asses and let them walk home or wherever they intended on crashing, but I would likely never live that down. Not while I was living in this town anyway. "It took you long enough," Jay said, knocking back his brother's flask again. "Yeah, my bad," I shrugged, choosing not to attempt reasoning with his exaggerated scowl. "I'm just fucking with you," he said, laughing. "Don't go getting all mopey now." I just forced out a chuckle while the guys got to their collectively hammered feet. Shotgun, John practically yelled as he bumped past me, staggering to my car. I just stood there for a moment while the guys took it upon themselves to load up, feeling my neck tense up. Hey, you coming or what? Kyle belted, hanging halfway out of my passenger side backseat window. Again, I chose to remain silent while I climbed in, buckled my seatbelt, and cranked the old Chevy. So, where to? I asked, attempting to sound far more thrilled than I felt. Well, we got something special planned, John said with a certain mischievousness in his voice, inspiring giggles from the others. But we gotta wait until it's dark. So, where to? I repeated, avoiding taking the bait of whatever he was likely to not let me in on. Square? Dylan suggested. Fuck it, John replied. Honestly, as much of a pain in the ass as my drunken friends were being, I ended up having a lot more fun than I anticipated, just immersing myself in the festivities at the town square. I stuffed my belly with a variety of samples from some of the many stalls serving everything from snacks to full-on meals. I played some of the carnival-type games while the guys made fun of me for doing so, of course. Still, I always loved fairs and carnivals as a kid, and this just allowed me to truly embrace that inner child I never really grew out of. I even won a fairly eerie-looking, enlarged teddy bear with one of its button eyes sewn shut and a variety of patches and stitches lining its limbs and scalp after successfully launching a series of rings around bottle tops. Though I wanted to hold on to my creepy little reward just to have a memento of my victory, the endless mocking from my associates inspired me to just hand it to a cute little vampire kid, after making sure it was okay with his mother, of course. The young boy lit up like it was his birthday, so I considered that a win in itself. I could have honestly spent the entire night out there, just enjoying the fun of it all, while indulging in more of the delicious food, but after the sun began to sink, John told me it was time to go. I convinced them to stick around for long enough to hear the mayor's speech, and watch the flame being lit at least. Even if the guys appeared more restless with every passing second, I still had fun. Again, had I not been forced into the role of their chauffeur for the night, I would have happily recommended that they go on without me. As it was, had I gone with what I wanted more at the time, I may have been able to continue looking forward to this time of year, rather than enduring events that would haunt me, likely for the rest of my days. I couldn't have known that at the time, of course, that our next destination would mark the beginning of the death of that inner child I had previously held so closely to my heart. I couldn't have predicted that my friends would set their crosshairs on the only other person with whom I had connected in this little town. I didn't even pay attention to where we were headed, only followed the directions called out from the passenger seat. It wasn't until my drunken GPS told me that we had arrived, as I slid my shifter back into neutral, when I realized where he'd led me. Huh? I said, staring perplexed at the house on the other side of the street, with the flickering lantern hanging from its entrance. Why did we come here? More intoxicated giggles echoed from the back seat, while John just glared at me with an expression of pure mischievous malice. What the fuck is this, John? Well, he said, cutting his eyes to those in the rear, and then back to mine. We kind of figured that you've been riding our popularity scot-free for a while now. About time you earned it. I didn't ask for your precious reputation, I said, throwing my shifter back into drive. I told you, Jay sneered from the back. Yeah, Kyle added. Figured he wouldn't have the balls for it. I just glared back at them through the rearview mirror. I wasn't about to play whatever ridiculous game they had in store for me, nor was I invested enough in their friendship to give two shits about whatever my punishment would be. They were in my car, after all. They could get out and walk for all I cared at the time. Nope, John said, his tone shifting from mischievous to something far more serious as he lay his hand on mine, which was still wrapped around the shifter. You're gonna do what you're told. You got me? Fuck you. I'm not doing shit. You can all go to... You're gonna do what I tell you to, he interrupted, tightening his grip on my hand. Or first, we're gonna kick your ass, see? Yeah, you got some moves and all, but you can't handle all 4 of us. My mind was all over the place, while my pulse quickened. He was right, of course. Sure, I could likely take at least 2 of them, but all of them? All of them with their pain receptors muted from the booze? Secondly, we will make sure that everyone at school knows what a little pussy you really are. I'll personally make your senior year so fucking rough, you'll run out of this town and never look back. It was then that I understood everything. They had never considered me a friend, just a little passion project to right the wrong I had committed in humiliating John when we first met. That whatever my decision would be in this scenario, whatever was between the 5 of us would be ending tonight. At this point, it was just a matter of how much I may suffer in the wake of her, falling out. I glanced at the mirror again to see the trio squeezed together, glaring at me with that same hateful gaze as the one riding shotgun. I had no doubt that John meant every single word of his threats, as did his little posse. What do you want me to do? I said with a sigh, shifting back into neutral. Good boy, John replied, pulling his hand free while patting mine like he was rewarding his puppy with a treat. Get out, Jace commanded from the back seat, as his brother opened my passenger side door. Moments later, all of us were standing on the sidewalk next to my car. Give me your keys, John commanded. I just gazed into his eyes with hate lining mine, dropping the keys into his waiting palm. I'll hold on to these for now, he said, slipping them into his pocket. Now, here's what you're gonna do. You're gonna go grab me that lantern off the old man's door. Then, you're gonna knock on his door and wait for him to answer. You're gonna tell him and all the world around him that he is a useless, fucked up, mad old bastard. You're gonna scream that shit, you hear me? Then, we're all gonna go for a little jog. Fuck you! I'm not... I barked, instantly buckling from the unexpected punch to my gut. No, fuck you! John yelled, slugging me across the face. You fucking embarrassed me, you piece of shit! You think I was gonna let that shit slide? Huh? I dropped to the concrete, coughing from the sucker punch to the gut while feeling my jaw already beginning to swell. I considered trying to run, to get to my feet and haul ass away from the quartet of bullying assholes, but I could barely catch my breath. He hit like a damn wrecking ball. If he had landed a shot like that on me on our first meeting, I likely wouldn't be where I was at the moment. Of course, back then, I was prepared for it. I saw it coming. This being out of the blue and completely unexpected, I was caught off guard, and in a shit ton more trouble than I was during that first brief fight. I didn't want to do what he was demanding. I didn't want to hurt Crockett, especially on a night that already haunted him, but it would seem that my choices were limited at the time. As I reluctantly crossed the street, cutting my eyes over my shoulder, I considered making a run for it. Given the smirk my veritable abductor had plastered across his smug face, he knew damn well what I was thinking. When he shook his head slowly from one side to the other, I knew he knew what I was thinking. I just gazed at the lantern hanging from the old man's door, even with the heckling group a ways behind me, barking demands from the other side of the road. As I gripped the eerie, festive decor from its hanger, I could only hope that Stanley would find a way to forgive me for what came next. With the lantern in one hand, I bounced the knuckles of my other against the door.
"I ain't got no offerings for you,"
belted out from inside. I knocked again, receiving a similar but far more agitated statement from the other side of the door. With my third knock, the volume ramped up on the angered muttering coming from inside, while my heart raced faster than it ever had before.
"I told you, I ain't... Oh, Josh, what are you..."
"I'm so sorry, Mr. Crockett," I whispered, my eyes beginning to well up while I cut them to the side, hopeful that this would lead his gaze to those behind me. "Please, forgive me for this." "You're a fucked up, useless, mad old bastard," I screamed, instantly feeling a stab of guilt in my chest at the hurt-filled expression glaring slack-jawed back at me. With that, I whispered again, "I'm so fucking sorry," before turning on my heels and sprinting back to the others who awaited my return.
"Hey!"
Crockett yelled.
"Give me that back!"
As soon as I reached the guys, they took off running down the street, calling for me to follow. When Stanley began to shakily pursue us, I couldn't figure out why we weren't taking the car. "What the fuck, John?" I barked, gasping for breath as my pulse was already all jacked up on Mountain Dew before taking off on a full-on sprint.
"You better keep up,"
he said, still chuckling like a madman. I followed along while we veered off the sidewalk, cutting between two houses just a ways from where my car was still parked. We ducked onto another, slimmer path, still dodging between and around other properties. It went on like this for a good 10 minutes straight, with my sides splitting and my lungs begging for rest with every single step. Before I knew it, we were jogging along another sidewalk in a part of town I had never seen before. It looked like every house on this street was abandoned and in varying stages of disrepair, some looking as though they should be downright condemned. It honestly felt like we had somehow crossed over into some post-apocalyptic wasteland, with garbage strewn across the lawns and crumbling foundations all around us. Just a few minutes later, the guys darted from the pavement into the overgrown front lawn of one of the less dilapidated buildings, pushing through the door to whatever lay within. I stopped for a moment, just glaring at the open entryway, gasping for breath, wrestling with another bout of apprehension.
"You coming or what?"
Dylan said, peeking his head out from inside. What the hell? What the hell is this?"
"It's a surprise,"
John called out, not so much as peering out from around the corner.
"Come on in, buddy boy."
Again, I just wanted to turn around, even if I had to completely abandon my car and just run back home. As it was, I didn't feel like I could even accomplish a light jog, let alone outrun these fucking assholes. With a trembling sigh, I strolled in, seeing my options as quite limited. When my eyes met a candle-lit and surprisingly pleasant-looking living room with two ratty couches on either side, a lone wooden chair right in the center of the room with a leather chair right across from it. I didn't have a chance to take in anything else before something struck me across the back of the head, immediately putting my lights out. When I was thrust back to awareness with a spike of pain across my face, I didn't have the time or focus to avoid the weathered and wrinkled hand swiftly moving in for a second strike. My head pounding, my cheek burning, and my thoughts reeling, I just glared into the rage-filled eyes of the old man as he backed away from me. Not breaking his gaze from mine, he sat down on the recliner, facing the chair to which I was bound, while the eerie lantern I had stolen was now sitting between us, in the dead center of an intricately drawn circle on the floor. I felt my pulse quickening once more with the realization that I could not move my limbs, or even hope to break them free of the tightly wrapped rope around my wrists, legs, and chest. "What the fuck is this?" I shouted, only to be greeted by more laughter from John and the boys, who now sat 2 on each couch on either side of where I faced Crockett.
It'll make sense soon enough, John said, still chuckling. Just hang in there a bit longer, yeah?
Are you a part of this? I said, glaring into the somber eyes of the old man. Are you with them?
It's, complicated,
he replied, his expression almost emotionless. Uncomplicated. Between the mocking quartet on either side of me and the blank stare of the old man, I had shifted from scared to incredibly pissed off in very little time. Had all of my friends set me up? Was Stanley the ringleader of this insanity? Was he really the mad old bastard most people in this town thought him to be?
Before we get to what we're here for,
Crockett said, breaking me from my enraged trance,
let me tell you a story. Let me tell you about how I almost died in this very house, some 6 decades ago to the day, on this very night.
With my limited options, I chose to let the old man take the spotlight for a time, while he told a story I could not bring myself to even entertain at the time. With the eyes of my former friends glued to him under the dim, flickering illumination, I was attempting to work as subtly as possible to break free of my bindings. Ultimately, not only would I not so much as succeed in slightly loosening the ropes around my wrists, but I would end up believing every single word that was spoken. Not at first, mind you. Not until I was face to face with the horrific proof of what actually lies beneath and beyond this little town. Something I was certain I would not survive, truth be told. And something that would be revealed only moments after Crockett's final tale came to a close.
We were around the same age as you are now, Charles Garnett and me, along with Paul Sanders and Winston McAllister. Charles was like a brother to me. Hell, we did just about everything together, I suppose. I was pretty close with the other guys who hung around with us too, but they didn't always get me, not the way my best friend did. Us two had been buddies since we were small, playing out in that overgrown grass just beyond these walls. We'd been on so many adventures out in the woods surrounding this here town, I probably couldn't even tell you how much of it was real anymore, and what was just in our wild imaginations. We come up through school by each other's sides, laughing and joking through every tedious second. He consoled me when I had my first breakup. Stacy Morningside was her name. Prettiest goddamn thing you ever seen. And I had his back when Dorothy Lane kicked his ass to the curb too. Yeah, friends and lovers came and went, well, as much as they tend to over those formative years, I suppose. But we'd still be as close as siblings when every other relationship would drift away. I suppose we'd still be close even after all these years, if... Sommerstide was always our favorite time of the year. Even as teenagers nearing adulthood with every passing day, we still went door to door, picking up offerings for the flame. We did, of course, up until that last year. The year after which I'd never celebrate this damned holiday again. Over the months leading up to that July, we'd spent a good bit of time at the library, fishing around in any books we could find about the local folklore. While we were just fine enjoying the fun of the season through our childhood years, the older we got, the more we questioned why this was the only town in the country that celebrated it. Hollows Grove takes a lot of pride in its rituals, so there was a whole section in the library dedicated to them. Yeah, most were kinda crudely pieced together, and some were so old they were barely holding together anymore. We needed special permission to access some of the more ancient ones, but Dale Jacobs, our history teacher, wrote us a permission slip to give to the librarian. Honestly, Hazel Bradshaw, who had ran that library for longer than I can even say, was so old herself, we could have likely handed her a chewing gum wrapper and she would have been none the wiser. But it's always best to have legitimate permission if the wrong person caught wind of what we were looking into. For the most part, you wouldn't see many folks of our age in a place like this. Maybe a quick in and out for a school project or something, but it was generally pretty deserted. You might see the occasional adult leafing through one book or another, but that was about it. Hell, we came and went for a good month, maybe a few days a week after school. Most of what we learned was just the history of the season, stuff that we're pretty much taught from birth around these parts. Yeah, a lot of it wasn't exactly to the letter of what my parents told me, but it was close enough. It was around that last week before the celebration when we came across the most fascinating book we'd ever seen. It was in rough shape, looked like it had been through the 7 levels of hell itself. Some pages were torn in half, some were halfway burnt, and others were so muddied up we couldn't make out a word. But there was still more than enough to capture our interest and imagination. The majority of the book was about the main ritual of the town, how the flames kept the darkness behind the curtain confined, how in the times before the elders came up with this, all kind of entities and evils would plague this slice of America for this one night, every single year. I still thought a lot of it was 20 shades of hogwash, but it was a damn fascinating read. While Charles and I were downright invested in every page we looked at, the final chapter was what really caught our attention. That was where this mysterious book revealed all kinds of other rituals. There were summonings, spells, and all kind of things that damn near made my mouth water. But just about every one was missing pages or was completely illegible. Just about every one. There was one final ritual towards those last few pages that wasn't only legible, but complete. It almost looked as though these pages had never been touched by human hands before. There wasn't even a single smudge across them. Not only that, it seemed pretty damn simple, too. All it promised was a peek. Just an opportunity to glance behind the veil, to really look into that darkness that lies behind the facade that this town wears every day. But it could only be performed on the night of Sommerstide, and only while the fire was still burning strong. Charles's folks were out of town for the week of the festivities, some business trip or something. It might have just been a getaway. Doesn't make no here no there, really. They would often pick up and leave this time of year. Suppose they didn't much care for the holiday, or so it seemed to me. Charles was apprehensive at first, uneasy about performing this spell in his home, but the book recommended that it be done indoors, and not out in the wilderness where something might be able to sneak through. Keep it secure, and keep it safe. Keep it confined and between the walls where it can't break out. Those words scared Charles a bit, and they made me a little bit unsettled too, if I'm being honest. But with how simple it looked to arrange this thing, I didn't see any reason to worry about messing it up or getting anything wrong. I could be one stubborn son of a bitch at times, so even when my buddy tried to talk me out of it, claiming that we maybe shouldn't go poking the bear with a stick, I wouldn't hear it. I had my mind made up, and that was that. The only part of it that did have me a bit apprehensive was the blood offering it spoke of. It didn't need much, just a few drops from the one that was performing the ritual, but I was never particularly good with pain. Other than that, though, All we were going to need was some candles, some chalk to draw the circle, and the words on the floor. A few hazelnuts, one from each of us, and a bowl of river water, along with some leaves, grass, and dirt. When that night arrived, we had everything in place. We took our time drawing the circle on the floor, and I kept my hands as still as I could, taking more care than I ever had in my handwriting. I wanted to be sure that every word was spelled perfectly and as clear as the morning sun. Paul and Winston had come along for the ride after we told them about what we were planning. They weren't as excited about this time of year as my buddy and I, but they got all kind of curious when we showed them the pages we swiped from the book. The kids were already running up and down the sidewalks outside, but we kept the porch light off in hopes of not being disturbed. We handed out a few offerings before the sun began to sink, just to keep the house as uncontaminated as possible when the time would arrive, but we wouldn't answer another knock once we got to work. When we knew the time had come for the flame to be awakened in the town square, I laid the bowl to the center of the circle. I gently poured in the dirt, leaves, and grass before each of us dropped in our offerings. And my hand began to quiver a bit as I ran my daddy's blade across my palm, but I cut it deep enough to squeeze out a few drops into the water, even if I did feel a touch lightheaded seeing my hand oozing blood. Charles looked as pale as a ghost when I started to speak the words, the same ones lined around the circumference of the circle on the floor. The other two were snickering a bit, apparently thinking that we were as dumb as a box of rocks all of a sudden. When the floor began to shudder, though, every giggle fell as quiet as the world beyond these walls. I felt my heart picking up its pace, while Charles started muttering under his breath. I couldn't make out what he was saying, on account of the rumbling sounding as though it might shake the house apart. But I couldn't help but wonder if we were thinking the same thing at the time, that we had made a grave mistake. It's hard to describe what happened next after that last word slipped through my mouth, but it was like this pinhole of vibrant green light appeared about 5 feet up from the dead center of that circle. I just stared at it with my mouth hanging wide open before it began to stretch like a knife was cutting through reality down to the floor and up another couple of feet. All four of us just stood there, paralyzed by this almost seamless, straight line of neon light carved through the curtain of this world, leaking through from the other one behind it. I was hypnotized by it, unable to tear my eyes away from that shimmering glow, even when the fingers wrapped around the seams. I couldn't make out what they were attached to, only what looked to be hundreds of slick, oily, and bony fingers gripping onto where this world met the other, pulling it further apart. We wanted to see what was on the other side, and it looked like we were about to witness that very thing. There was a howling, eerie chorus of what could have been thousands, millions of voices shrieking out from within that rift, making us on this side scream out our own denial of this horrific sound. Charles was yelling for me to make it stop, but I put so much planning and research into how to open the godforsaken thing, I never even thought to look into how to shut it. The opening was splitting wider and wider still, while I fought to snap my senses back to the present and leaf through the pages we'd stolen.
Do you want to see?
A haunting voice whispered into my ear while I knelt on the floor trying to focus my eyes on the words.
Come closer.
I tried to ignore it, forcing my attention onto the pages in my shivering hands.
Come closer.
That voice repeated, damn near shattering my will to resist it. As scared as I was, fucking terrified to be blunt, I swear that part of me was begging to walk right up to that hole, to dive right in and immerse myself in the horrors within. I was crying like a damn kid and praying to every single god I could to release us from this madness. I was so focused on both the task at hand and fighting off that temptation to approach the rift, I didn't even realize what was happening. Not until I heard the much louder and far more agonized scream coming from this side of the looking glass. Even though it was Paul who had walked right up to that damn thing, the wailing wasn't coming from his mouth. Hell, he didn't even try to fight off the slender, greasy arms and hands wrapping around him from foot to face. I just knelt there, still holding those pages tightly, as a foul-smelling wind blew out from that hole in the world, while the hands spun Paul around to face us. I whimpered in sheer denial when the fingers pierced into his flesh, leaking his blood to the shimmering floor beneath his feet. I couldn't move. I couldn't make myself do anything other than glare at the grotesque scene playing out before my eyes. Charles and Winston were both yelling out, but every sound was muffled and muted behind the howling from beyond, and that wind growing more violent by the second. It wasn't until Charles ran up, with Winston far more reluctant in his steps just a ways behind him, when I finally broke out of that trance. As soon as my closest friend in the world got close, I ran up beside him. We tried to pull Paul free of those hands, but there was so goddamn many, almost covering every single inch of him, that he hadn't a chance of grasping onto anything but them. We were punching at the fingers, yanking him by the wrists, but he couldn't break the first one loose. They wouldn't come loose for even a moment, not until they all pulled back at once. Though his gaze had been blank, almost catatonic while he was held in place, oozing fluids to the ground, Paul's eyes snapped back to the here and now in those final seconds, before he was pulled through to the other side. I could see it in his face, as the terror gripped him in his last moments, that he knew his journey was over. Charles fell to his knees right in front of that split in reality, screaming out against the ones that stole our friend. Me and Winston backed away from it in sheer denial of what we'd seen. Charles was muttering over and over that we needed to close it. "Close it, Stan. Fucking close it," he kept saying, motionless and flat. I whipped the pages from the floor with that emerald aura lighting the path across the passages. As soon as my eyes fixed on the incantation required to slam that door shut, along with one more offering of blood, another scream of agony pulled my eyes away from it. I don't know when it happened, when those hands shot right back out. It looked like Charles had managed to avoid most of them, but the ones that held onto his ankles and his shins as he clawed at the floor to pull himself free looked like they weren't going to give up without a fight. "Close it, Stanley!" Charles shrieked out as I let the sheets fall from my grasp to reach out for him. Me and Winston both grabbed him by the arms, digging our heels against the floor, yanking back with every ounce of strength we had left. Both of my friends were shouting the same demand, and no matter how much I ached to keep helping pull my friend back, I knew they were right. I ran back to the circle, yelling out every word on the page, digging my pocket knife back into the palm, spewing blood into that bowl of ingredients. I was so worked up that my tongue tripped across the words, making me have to backtrack a couple of times. But the second that last syllable left my mouth, the ground stopped quaking. The howling and violent wind fell silent, and darkness reclaimed the room. Gasping for breath, and even from the split in my side, It took me a minute to glance up to make certain the rift had sealed itself back shut. It had done just that, but not without claiming one last treasure from this world. Once more I found myself paralyzed when my eyes met Winston, having fallen to his knees. I heard him wailing and sobbing, cursing at the top of his lungs. That's when I saw what he still held on to. That he still held on to the arms of the best friend I ever had. Arms that lay limp beside the oozing head on the floor. It took us a while to motivate ourselves to move. The shock hit us both pretty hard. A shock that gave way to panic. Fear of what was coming for us next. Back in the world we were almost dragged from. We knew we'd be locked away for good if anyone caught wind of what we'd done. And as broken as we were about the friends we'd lost, we weren't about to confess our lives away. It was Winston's idea to strip down the head, to mimic the craft of the carver. Everyone around these parts knew he was real back then. It was more of a fact than it is now. Facts tend to turn to folklore after a time. Back then, it wasn't a surprise to find a new lantern or two around town come the morning following Sommerstide. It took some time to get the work done. There was a lot of crying, a good deal of stomach churning, and a copious amount of vomit. We had to dig around in the garage for the stuff we needed to make it close enough, but just about every home has a lantern or two for those unexpected power outages of small-town America. We thought about dropping what was left of Charles in the woods for some unsuspecting hiker to discover, but given the wreck we'd already made of the house, we figured it might be best to just leave it here after all. When the Garretts got home from their trip, they'd assumed the carver had come calling, and that'd be the end of it. There was an investigation over the following days, and there was only one body. Well, one pile of remains, though there were 2 missing kids. The thing is, though, this town is no stranger to this sort of thing, especially around this time of year. Hell, I think the investigation process was mostly for show, as they know damn well what's going on beneath the surface. Even if we did get away with everything, me and Winston would have to carry this for the rest of our lives. Whatever it was we almost let into the world that night seemed to have sunk into the cracks of this side of town. Within 5 years or so, everyone on this street was either dead or moved on. Can't rightly say if that was the fact of the matter, though, that it was our actions that caused this street to fall apart, or just the natural order and all that. It feels like it, though. Suppose that, along with the events of that ill-fated Sommerstide, is what inspired Winston to stick his daddy's gun in his mouth, almost a half a decade after that night. Some time back, after spending most of my life searching for ways to undo the things I'd done, I finally tracked it down. The truth about that first ritual I performed here. The truth that it wasn't meant to just be a glance behind the veil, but an offering to those on the other side. Not only that, but there was a flip side to that very spell that stole my friends from me. Something to return what was stolen, for a price. I managed to bribe a buddy down at the station to get my hands on that again,
Crockett said, gesturing to the lantern propped up on the floor, right in the center of the intricately drawn circle.
It tore me up to see my work firsthand, after decades of scar tissue forming around those old wounds. But I needed it. For this.
This? I asked, my voice barely a trembling croak.
You don't get anything for nothing, kid. This whole world, as well as the one beneath it, is built in a foundation of exchange. You gotta sacrifice something to get something back. We were friends, I stuttered, unable to form a rational thought. Exactly, he said, leaning forward to gaze directly into my eyes. And that's why this'll work. We were friends, and yet you still betrayed me, just like I betrayed my friends back then. Equivalent exchange, kid. The betrayer for the betrayed. He didn't speak another word after that. Well, not to me, anyway. I tried to protest, begging him to understand that I was forced to betray him. Of course, when John and his posse of asshats began to assist the old man in making the final preparations, it wasn't until then that I truly understood what tonight was all about. The 5 of them talked and joked around like old friends as they went on about their business, continuing to ignore my bargaining. This was a setup from the start, possibly from that first conversation with Crockett. He needed a friend who would betray him, and I fell for the entire masquerade. I was lured in by John's phony respect after I kicked his ass in front of everybody. I fell for the old man's solitude and his need for someone to confide in. Even if I did attempt to fight against it, I fell right into this trap by stealing from and insulting Stanley Crockett before being led to what was to be my tomb. I couldn't help but laugh as I ranted about this realization to those preparing to sacrifice me. The uneasy glances my words inspired only secured the truth of them. No one so much as acknowledged me, no matter what I said or did. They didn't even attempt to stop me from trying to break free, though my efforts were proving completely useless at best. Clearly, I was no longer worthy of a response, if I ever had been, to any of these pricks. I was simply their lamb to the slaughter. I had no idea how this was going to go, nor how much suffering lay ahead of me, but I wasn't about to give up without a fight. Well, if I could fucking get loose anyway. As the quartet who led me here took their places back on the twin couches, the old man knelt down in the center of the circle, lined across the floor before me. I felt my pulse throbbing within my neck and wrists as he slid the blade across his palm, uttering bizarre words in a little more than a whisper. Though whatever was happening was hidden from my eyes, I could see a subtle glow breaching across the room from my back. The gasps and uneasy mutters from either side of me assured me that I should probably be thankful that I couldn't see what was coming. What was coming for me. As the light grew brighter and more vibrant, a haunting, croaking sound accompanied the glow, along with my associates seeming far more unsettled than before. They started bargaining with Crockett, begging him to cease his chanting, but he couldn't be stopped. Plus, it would appear that the boys were far more reluctant to approach him as the ground began to shake. With shrieks of fear from my left and right, and the wide, horrified eyes of the old man in front of me, I felt my blood racing to my churning gut, with the sound of 2 heavy feet landing on the floor behind me. My goose flesh was trembling more violently than the floor as the steps approached where I sat. I fought the urge to turn my head in an attempt to see who or what was standing there, exhaling a warm breath on the back of my neck. What happened next looked to have caught everyone off guard, even more than me. My battle to keep my eyes fixed on the front door I was facing fell short as I whipped my head to the side, distracted by the howling scream coming from John. I could not hope to form a single word, let alone a scream of my own, as I saw the wispy, shadowed form tackle my would-be friend. His brother leapt from beside him, not as much as attempting to help,
while the smoky fingers gripped John's upper and lower jaw, prying it far wider apart than the bones and flesh could tolerate. I gazed on, slack-jawed and horrified, while the skin tore and the jaw dislocated as the shadow forced itself into the ripped, gaping maw it pried open. The others around me were yelling out in their own shrieks of protest, while practically falling from their perches to run for the door. When the final remnants of wispy smoke drifted into the peeled-open orifice, John smacked his mouth back shut, while the bones shifted back into place. Kyle was yanking on the doorknob, crying and wailing, but it would appear that the exit was sealed shut.
"Nuh-uh,"
John said in a haunting, echoed voice.
"Nobody leaves. Not until we're done here."
The torn flesh flapped against the exposed bone while he spoke, still oozing onto his shoulders and chest, but it didn't seem to be bothering him. He didn't even wince as he shifted his jaw, rolling his neck from one side to the other, before focusing his gaze on the shivering old man still knelt on the floor.
"Charles?"
Crockett whimpered, still frozen in place.
"Chuck's dead, Stanley,"
John said, though I understood that he was no longer behind the wheel.
"He didn't quite make it to where I landed. To where you sent me."
The old man's eyes grew wide as the realization struck him, not only with the fact that he did not look upon the one he hoped to bring forth, but in who he was glaring at behind the eyes of my old buddy.
"Paul?"
I don't even know if I can exactly describe the expression he made as a smile, as the torn strips of meat and flesh didn't lend themselves to any recognizable facial articulation, but those now darkened eyes appeared to lift a little, as though that's what he was attempting to convey. While Crockett and his old friend glared at one another, Kyle and Dylan were both attempting to break through the seemingly impenetrable door. Jace had fallen to his knees, whining and wailing.
"Give him back!"
he yelled out, finally claiming the attention of the one who had only recently joined us.
"You were supposed to take him!"
He was pointing at me, darting his eyes between the two of us now.
"Why didn't you take—" "He is not the betrayer in this room,"
Paul barked, still not breaking his gaze from the old man.
"You don't think we can tell the difference? From what I can see, he is the only one who has not betrayed anyone in this room." Where's Charles?"
Crockett whimpered.
"Like I told you,"
Paul said with an exhausted sigh.
"He died. Or, in this case, you killed him. But we see everything, you see? Over there, back home, you kind of mixed up some of your recollection over the years, huh?" "What? No, that's not how it—" "Guess you had to paint yourself in a better light, huh? Make it easier to live with yourself." "No, it's not." "No!"
Paul shouted, finally claiming the undivided attention of everyone in the room.
"Let me refresh your memory a bit, yeah? You see, when those fingers peeled open the world before us, we all panicked. We all ran for it. Even you, Stanley. When the hand shot out of that rip, reaching out for whoever they could grab onto. You remember what happened next?"
Crockett's face suddenly drained of all its color, as his bodily tremors escalated to the next level.
"That's right. You pushed me, didn't you? Pushed me right into them when they almost got you."
The old man's breathing transformed into borderline hyperventilation. He clutched at his chest, while Paul glared down at him through John's eyes.
"Charles, Yeah, he tried to grab me, snatched me by the hands as they pulled me towards that opening in reality. Wasn't until he got halfway sucked through with me, your chicken shit ass got to work. You had just been staring on the whole damn time, not so much as lifting a finger. I was gone already. Chuck couldn't stop what was happening, no matter how much he tried. But they didn't have him yet. Well, not fully. Then, you closed that door shut right around him. You didn't reach for him, nor me for that matter. You didn't even try. You wouldn't so much as glance up from those pages until you were sure that you were safe.
Every eye glared down the weeping senior citizen as he wailed against the conveniently forgotten truth.
The rest went, well, close enough to how you told it. But you ain't no hero, old pal. Not by a damn sight.
The room fell silent, aside from the ambient humming echoing from the other place, and the fairly constant whining coming from those who lured me here. Paul and Crockett continued to just glare at each other, one still trembling and terrified, and the other pensive and cold. As the grizzled and torn face looked at me, he paced toward where I sat, still bound to the uncomfortable damn chair. I can't say why, but even though I trembled all the more violently as he neared, I knew he wasn't going to hurt me. When he reached for the ropes, swiftly and easily slipping them loose from around me, I didn't wince or jump.
Go,
he said, gesturing at the door with a nod.
You three. Yeah, you can go too. But John,
Jace whimpered, shakily getting to his feet.
Time to go, Stan,
Paul said, ignoring the pleas of his meat-suit sibling.
Let him go! He doesn't...
I lay my hand on his arm as Paul cut him a menacing gaze. I just shook my head, fully aware that if he put up any sort of fight, he would be dragged through that ripping reality along with Crockett.
Go,
Paul said, one final time, reaching a hand to the old man still on the floor. Without wasting another second muddling things over or giving in to my curiosity of watching Crockett getting dragged back to his friend's place, I pulled open the door, immediately walking out into the chilly night.
Wait,
Paul called out, freezing me in my tracks. Shit, I thought. Was the tease of release just a trick? If I took off running, would those shadowy fingers shoot from the rift to drag me through? Was there ever really a chance of me surviving this? I reluctantly turned to face the haunting gaze of someone I once considered a friend, my heart thrusting itself against my sternum, terrified of what was to come.
You're gonna need these,
Paul said, slipping my keys from John's pocket, tossing them through the splayed open doorway. The second my keychain landed in my open palm, I turned away from that damned house, not so much as waiting for those who had been granted their freedom along with me. I slowly paced forward, not looking back, trying to ignore the gut-wrenching screams coming from behind me. As soon as I was far enough away to feel secure in my release, I took off sprinting back to my abandoned Chevy. I heard the hastened footfalls of my would-be companions a ways behind me, but I wasn't about to wait for them. When I reached my car, I practically leapt in, cranked it up, and tore away from Crockett Street. How the others would get back to their homes, or how Jace was going to explain to his folks where his brother was, that was not my problem anymore. I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask for their friendship or the mockery of what a friend should be. None of this was my responsibility, even if it would be my burden to bear. I just wanted to wash my hands of every last one of them. Only a handful of both adults and children were walking the sidewalks by this point. I was momentarily distracted by some guy I noticed on the side of the road, hobbling in the direction of the town square, with bloodied gauze wrapped around his hands and splashed across his shirt, holding a crimson-stained pillowcase. I just shook my head at the fairly uninspired costume, attempting to allow my mind to focus on anything but the horrors I had witnessed this night. When I reached my home, I just sat in my car for a while, trying my damnedest to calm my racing pulse before facing my mother. I wouldn't tell her or anyone else about my first Sommerstide in the little town of Hollows Grove. While I can't exactly say I'll be looking forward to next year's celebration, I have first-hand experience now on what these sacred rituals are keeping locked away, along with those that may set them free should the curious minds of the world make their best efforts. Yeah, who knows what next summer may have in store for me or this town. Whatever it is, though, I'm staying at home.